The deadline passed on a law that binds the White House to tell Congress everything it knows about the origin of the pandemic, but here we are, still impatiently waiting. Reporter at US Right to Know, Emily Kopp, is here with us to discuss the latest developments on this front. Welcome, Emily.
Hey, great to be here.
So tell us, what do you think? Will the Biden administration ever release these declassified documents?
Yes, I think eventually they will be released. They're legally bound to, but the declassification deadline happened to coincide with this trip that Secretary of State Antony Blinken took to Beijing, and an attempt by the U.S. to cool off tensions with China. So presumably that has something to do with the delay. I will say, too, that I think part of the delay could be related to the fact that the intelligence community has failed in an enormous way as it relates to this virus. And my speculation would be that the same intelligence community that failed to warn us that this virus was coming is now gearing up to tell us that it failed to find the origins. And that's really unacceptable. So can go into more detail on that.
Do you think there's also a bit of embarrassment on behalf of public health officials who started out the first few months of the pandemic claiming that this was a naturally occurring virus that was zoonotic in origin, and now the consensus has kind of shifted around the idea of this leaking from the Wuhan Institute of Virology?
That could certainly be a factor. And don't forget that the Office of the Director of National Intelligence also said that this was a natural virus. And what we've learned through Freedom of Information Act requests is that the people who were advising the intelligence community around the same time that it said that the intelligence community agrees with the scientific consensus that the virus is not natural, either had ties to the Wuhan Institute of Virology or were part of that infamous teleconference with Anthony Fauci in February 2020, in which they went from saying this looks awfully engineered and we're concerned that this came from a lab to doing a 180 within days and saying that that idea was crackpot. So I think that's part of the intelligence community's failures, right? The fact that they, as they were trying to assess whether or not this was a lab origin in 2020, when the evidence was the freshest and our capacity for digging up information was probably the greatest, it was leaning on people like Ralph Baric, a coronavirologist who worked directly with the Wuhan Institute of Virology to make viruses more dangerous. It leaned on people like Robert Gary, one of those virologists who participated in that teleconference with Anthony Fauci. It leaned on Christian Andersen, another virologist who met with Anthony Fauci. And it consulted with Anthony Fauci, the head of the agency that underwrote the Wuhan Institute of Virology to the tune of millions of dollars. So yeah, I mean, if I had to speculate here, I would say that the intelligence community is taking its time to declassify this information because it's going to reflect very poorly on the intelligence community. So if we go back to 2020, when this virus first emerged, when the global community first became aware of a novel coronavirus coming out of Wuhan, the intelligence community took China's word for it that it wasn't a transmissible virus, that it wasn't spreading human to human for 3 weeks. Which, doesn't sound like a long period of time, but when you're talking about the need for contact tracing and the need to make sure a virus doesn't spread globally and become a pandemic that lasts for years, that 3 weeks is really critical. And so we know that the intelligence community failed in a major way there. Is telling news organizations like the New York Times that it simply is not capable of coming up with an assessment of the origins. And that's a major failure too, because we were either not prioritizing the Wuhan Institute of Virology for intelligence collection, or we were funding research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology as a sort of harebrained method of intelligence collection to learn what Chinese scientists were working on, and it monumentally backfired. So that's my sense of why it's taking so long, because there's very few ways that you can parse this that, saves the reputation of the intelligence community when it comes to their core job of protecting the American public from foreign threats. We often talk about the failures of the intelligence community as it relates to 9/11. We had, periods of time during this pandemic where we were losing the amount of people that we lost in 9/11 every single day. So I think that's an unfortunate dynamic of, this mystery around the origins of COVID, is that so much of the information we're getting is filtered through the two most powerful governments in the world, China and the US.
Is it your belief that in these declassified soon-to-be files, that there was a conclusive finding about the origin of COVID-19, or is it your belief that because they failed early on to investigate, that it's unlikely that there is any conclusive evidence of the origin of COVID-19?
I won't pretend to have any, special insight into their thinking, but I have seen a lot of public records that suggest to me that they don't want to know. So in the last few days, there's been a lot of talk about these Wuhan Institute of Virology researchers who became sick in the fall of 2019. This is before the wet market outbreak, so that's strong evidence of a lab origin. For some reason, the intelligence community doesn't find that relevant to the origins of COVID. And that intelligence wasn't processed until these investigators with the State Department dug it up kind of in late the fall of 2020. And I've seen emails between these State Department investigators and people at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence and at the Department of Health and Human Services, which of course funded the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And they got a lot of pushback for digging for more information about a possible lab origin from those agencies. And it's also not clear to me that some of these intelligence agencies have updated their assessments in the last 2 years. So we know that, the Biden administration ordered a 90-day review back in 2021. To my knowledge, only the Department of Energy has looked at new evidence and updated its assessment. And again, that is an enormous failure. And, the New York Times had a story where some intelligence officials were saying that Beijing doesn't want to know the origins and is not looking, and so there are no secrets to dig up. And to me, that seems like some projection by the United States, which doesn't want to know because of our potential culpability. And, to me, it doesn't seem credible that, the intelligence community spies on millions of Americans, but doesn't spy on the Americans who are souping up viruses in Chinese labs and in Chinese labs with military ties. To me, that just doesn't pass the smell test. So yeah.
Has the Biden administration even acknowledged that it missed the deadline for releasing these files?
Not to my knowledge, no. And I know that they're getting a lot of pressure on Capitol Hill, and to my knowledge, I don't think anyone on Capitol Hill has heard anything from them either. So,
wow. All right. Good to know. Well, thank you, Emily Kopp, for helping us break all of this down. We'll be back with more Rising after this.